Hi, my name is Michael Smook. Today is July 13th. It's a Friday, and we're in the year 2018. I'm speaking to you from my home in Forest Hills, New York. Forest Hills is in Queens County, which is an outer borough of the city of New York. Today is a continuation of Is It Safe Now? Episode 26. This is part 2 today. It's been about a week since our last talk. Part 2 is entitled Miscalculations. When I say miscalculations, it's going to be less about misadventures in the Middle East post 9/11, which relates to the George W. Bush administration and mistakes that were made. And we're going to spend less time on that. And really what I'm much more concerned with, how can we develop a systematic, methodical, dispassionate way of developing foreign policy in times of peace, in times of war, in times that are somewhere in the middle. We need to be cool, calm, collected, and have a foreign policy that works. And I decided to do it this way because I'm thinking during my lifetime, we lived through the Vietnam War, and now post 9/11, we've made some mistakes as well. So we're going to drill down and look at this, and the two concepts, the underlying concepts, which I believe will power our foreign policy, and what I'm offering the viewer and anyone else, for example, in government, who might want to use it. I'm suggesting that we need to look at two concepts and partner them together. One is called the virtual microscope, and the other one is called the reverse timeline. And before we talk into detail about that, let's just summarize what we discussed last week, part 1, 9/11, what happened. In summary, what happened on September 11th, the United States was attacked not by a nation state, but by a terrorist organization. 19 men from the Middle East. They were in the Northeast. They broke into teams of 4. They boarded jet airliners in northeastern airports, and they were fully laden with fuel, and they went on a mission of suicide attacks. 2 of the planes were American Airlines, 2 of them were United Airlines, and 2 of those planes headed for New York. They crashed into the World Trade Centers, first the North, then the South Tower, and also destroyed 1,100 buildings that day. And 2 other planes were headed to Washington, D.C. One crashed into a wing of the corridor of the Pentagon, which is the military headquarters for the military. And a 4th plane never made it out of Pennsylvania. It crashed in Pennsylvania. But it was the plan was, we believe our intelligence community said that that plane was headed toward either the White House, where the president lives and works, or it could have gone to another iconic building, Capitol Hill, where Congress, the U.S. Senate, and the House of Representatives work. Now, the symbolism of all this, from the terrorist point of view, they were successful in 3 out of 4 planes in these suicide attacks. And what they were looking to do was they wanted to crash into buildings that was symbolic of the United States, of our financial wealth, of our military powers, of our political and diplomatic gravitas post-Cold War. The United States is arguably the sole remaining superpower in the world. So this attack, as stated before, but it's worth mentioning again, is it was a 2-part attack in the sense that I feel that what the terrorists were out to do was, in boxing parlance, land a body blow against the United States. But what they really wanted to do is they wanted these attacks to serve as a warning against the regimes they hope to overthrow in the Middle East: Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. And we could add Syria and Iraq to the list now, after seeing the mayhem, murder, and destruction of property in the Middle East in this decade as well. So that's how I viewed the situation at 9/11, what happened that day, and shortly thereafter. And the underlying premise of the talk last week, today, and next week is that the United States is suffering from a form of shock. You could call it atrocity trauma. And I believe that even today, 17 years later, that the country still suffers from a residue of the after effects of September 11th. And so that about summarizes what we spoke about last week in part one. Now let's go to part two, miscalculations. The thing about it is we're going to talk about what can the United States do to have a methodology, a dispassionate way of looking at the world through the eyes of a more objective person. And with the virtual microscope, we've spoke about this before in episode 20, but it bears repeating again because we're going to build on it. The virtual microscope is, I believe that when the United States is looking at foreign affairs, the United States has relations with 190 or more nations in the world. And also there are groups of nations that the United States has relations with, like the European Union, and we're part of NATO. So what we need to do is we need to look at the world through the eyes of a social scientist. And that's why I call it the virtual microscope. And just backing up a bit, the way I recently came to through this idea is I'm thinking, well, in the world of medicine, a doctor and a laboratorian, if they're looking at a patient and they're looking at a disease, they take a specimen, they put it under a microscope, under other instruments, there are lab tests, and this way they're able to determine if there is a disease, and with all the tests and diagnostic equipment, we could make a determination as to a course of treatment and pursue heroic medicine. So I'm thinking to myself, in foreign policy, we have social scientists, and they have such a base of knowledge, and in a multidisciplinary approach, we can do better analyses. So using a virtual microscope, we need to look at history and government, and I think we shouldn't be short-sighted. We shouldn't just look at the last few years or 10 or 20 years. Sometimes we need to go back hundreds of years. And also, understanding history and government links up with the other social sciences. For example, we need to closely look at what's going on in a country in terms of psychology and sociology. And I'll tell you why. We need to look at traditions, customs, folklore, language, food, tribes, as well as bigger criteria, race, ethnicity, and religion. So if you understand all these things, then the connection back to history and government, it makes a lot more sense. And you understand the social fabric which brings a country together. And that's why the virtual microscope could be very effective and very helpful in policy. Also, geography plays an important role, and also meteorology. Meteorology is not a social science, but geography can be considered that. Between the two, when we look at the countries we've been at war with, Afghanistan, Iraq, and before that Vietnam, we're talking about different climates, mountainous, desert, jungle-like, different weather patterns, monsoons, snow in the winter in the mountainous regions, little rainfall in the desert-like conditions. But for example, in Iraq, they have the Tigris and the Euphrates, which is where civilization as we know it started many thousands of years ago. So the fact is, geography and weather or meteorology also play a role into one of the tools, one of the topics that must be considered in a multidisciplinary approach by using the virtual microscope. Also, what we need to do is look at economics. Economics is important. I'll give you an example how countries are rising and falling throughout the world. One example, Syria in many ways was a developing nation, largely agricultural, some oil. They didn't make very much, but Damascus had a metropolitan, sophisticated air to it, but they were basically a developing nation. What happened is, I believe because of global warming, there was extreme drought, and because of the other stresses and strains on the society, a civil war broke out in Syria. And what happened is we now have 300,000 dead. We have a half a dozen different sides fighting it out. You have millions of people who are in refugee camps outside of Syria. millions of people inside of Syria that they're in other parts of Syria away from their homes, and they really can't go back because there's still a shooting war going on, plus their homes have been destroyed. So Syria is an example of a developing nation that took a step backward, and to rebuild Syria, and it is important that Syria is eventually rebuilt, but it may take a generation once the shooting wars are over with. An example of a country that took a step forward after a shooting war is South Korea. The Korean War was, and before South Korea was in the Korean War against North Korea, there was the World War II against the Japanese. But South Korea, 65 years ago, after the war, with the aid of the United States and the United Nations, we fought the North Koreans and the Communist Chinese to a draw. And what South Korea has done, they have 50 million people. And through their own hard work, their entrepreneurial skills, and foreign aid, South Korea now has the 11th largest economy in the world. And that's important. When you think of South Korea, you think of telecommunications and phones, and you think of Samsung. When you think of South Korea and you think of transportation and automobiles, you think of Hyundai and Kia. And also, South Korea is one of the leading nations in the world in shipbuilding and steel production as well. When you total up the total economic output of South Korea during the year, it's the 11th largest country in the world. Guess what number 12 is? It's Russia. Russia has almost 3 times as many people, 140 million plus people. What do? They don't make much of anything. What they do is extract natural gas and oil from the ground, and that pays the bills for them. So for Russia's sake, I'm hoping that along the way they'll develop an entrepreneurial spirit and they'll start to build things. I think it's better for the Russian people and it's better for the world. But anyway, getting back to economics and developing nations, the thing is that developing nations, some are taking a step back or two because of war, and South Korea, fortunately, maybe they're the exception to the rule, but they went through World War II and the Korean War, and now in the last 65 years they're booming, and they're a strong ally of the United States. Also, economics is very important. It is a social science, but it does tie into business sciences and finance. When you look at major U.S. companies, Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, Facebook, Microsoft, ExxonMobil, IBM, and so many others, Big Pharma, and agricultural businesses, Archer Daniels Midland. The thing about this is business sciences and finance tie into economics, and it is important in an interconnected world financially that we need to take into consideration in analyzing foreign policy. We need to go outside of economics, which is a social science, but the overlapping areas of business science and finance, and understanding how the United States fits in with the rest of the world. It's all not just government, it's also private endeavors. Private endeavors in the United States are 75% of the economy. So the thing is that that's why we need to expand outward from economics and get into these other disciplines as well. Also, in terms of the virtual microscope, at some point, this is a multidisciplinary approach. What we need to do is we need to call in military sciences as well. So what I'm talking about is I'm talking about a multidisciplinary effort, and it could turn out to be a voluminous report, but we're going to stop on this part and then marry it up with the virtual timeline, and it'll all make sense because we're going to pull it all together. So stay with me. Let's talk about the second concept. The second concept is the virtual timeline, and I believe this is key for future foreign policies, and it does tie into, it's the reverse timeline, and the reverse timeline does tie into the virtual microscope. This is the reverse timeline. I didn't give it a name before. We spoke about it in episode 4, but I'm calling it the reverse timeline because it needs to have a name. But the idea comes from Richard Neustadt. I studied him in college back in the 70s. He was a political scientist Harvard professor. He was an advisor. He worked for Harry Truman. He was an advisor to presidents from John Kennedy to Bill Clinton, and he wrote books. And he was the guru in terms of presidential power. And in a book I read 20, 25 years ago, Neustadt said, "How do we avoid another Vietnam?" And that was an interesting question. And then he said, what you need to do is you need to look at a situation and you need to work your way backwards. Now, for the sake of Neustadt, I'm going to add to that and say, let's say we're going to look at Vietnam after the fact, and let's say we're going to go into war with Vietnam. So, where are we at the end game of a war with Vietnam in terms of military affairs, diplomacy, politics, economics? Where is the United States at the end of a confrontation with North Vietnam? And then, according to Neustadt, we take a step back. What is our plan A, the step before we arrive at our ultimate goal? That's plan A. And then what are the traps? That's what Neustadt used. He used the term traps. But what are the traps or the challenges that can impede in the United States achieving their ultimate goals in a war in Vietnam? And then and then you need to look at your plan B, C, and D. You need to have, you need to understand what are the various things that could go wrong, and what are your workarounds to fix it. And then Neustadt said, continue to work in a reverse timeline. Well, he never used that specific term, but he said go in reverse order. And then he said in each case you need to ask the same questions and write down the answers. And then you get to a point, and then I'm thinking through where Neustadt was headed in this analysis. Where I think Neustadt was headed was, he was saying that what happens when you get to a point where you're going to start a war, prosecute a war? What are your ultimate goals, and what are the things that could get in the way? What can be problematic? And then you could continue to work backwards. You could go to the run-up to the war, 6, 12, 24 months leading up to a war. Where do you want to go? And what do you do? What are your goals? And what's your plan A? And if things get in the way, what are your alternative plans? How can you meet these challenges? And I've been talking about war, and I'm doing a reverse timeline, but actually this is a useful tool. But actually, once you've completed your reverse timeline, and then you look at it from the other direction, from beginning to end, from A to Z, you may decide that the costs of war far outweigh the benefits of war. So, and then you look at your plan B, C, and D, and you'll find out, well, B, C, or D relate to situations where we're going to go for peace, and we're going to have peace endeavors. So this is something that we need to think about. And so the thing about it is, what Neustadt is talking about, the reverse timeline, is as much as a useful tool for determining, talking yourself out through analysis, through looking at costs and benefits, and determining that waging peace is far better than waging war. So the reverse timeline, even though I started talking about war, it's really a way of trying to be as objective as possible, and trying to develop the best plans that are for the nation, for the United States, for our allies, and we may find that it's much more beneficial. In fact, I think most of the time we're going to find out it's far more beneficial to wage peace than war, and maybe we'll make a friend by having better relations with somebody who's a rival and a potential enemy, or at least we'll neutralize the situation. So that's the reverse timeline. So the reverse timeline is important in foreign policy, as is the virtual microscope. When you attach the two together, you come up with better plans. You not only have a one plan, you have multiple plans. And this reminds me of not a social scientist, but a chemist and a microbiologist, Louis Pasteur, who once said, chance favors the well-prepared mind. Now, if this is a multidisciplinary approach, and the well-prepared minds come up with well-thought-out plans, that means for all situations, in times of good and bad, potential unexpected situations like a 9/11, we'll be ready. So the fact is to be prepared and have a well-prepared mind and well-thought-out plans, and have different options that government has ready. So this way we could be much more methodical in our foreign policy. And this is my way of trying to intellectually work our way through post 9/11 stress or atrocity trauma. And that's the whole point of the talk today. So hopefully you'll agree with most of what I say, or at least some of it. So I've covered just about everything I need to in part 2. So looking forward to next week, we're going to call it Suggested Remedies and Concluding Thoughts. And what we're going to talk about is post 9/11, the rise of the surveillance state, and the need for privacy protections. So we must keep the homeland safe, but we also can't throw civil liberties under the bus, because if we do that, what's the difference between the United States and an authoritarian regime? So the fact that our founding fathers and subsequent statesmen and women have come up with amendments to the Constitution, so we are a freer people, and it makes us stronger by not living in an authoritarian state. So these are the things that we need to talk about. And the hint for next week, just to give you a tiny spoiler alert, is I'm leaning towards the minority and the dissenters, the politicians who are statesmen, and there are academics who've worked in the executive branch who have expertise in privacy protection, but they understand the great needs of the surveillance state. So we're going to talk about that, and it should be interesting. And these are the kind of conversations we need to have post 9/11. Also next week, we're going to talk about how can the United States better prepare for another 9/11. And the thing about it is we're going to talk a lot less about bullets and bombs, and we're going to talk a lot more about how the United States could devote more resources towards resiliency. And so we're going to talk about cyber issues, but a lot of other bread and butter issues that may surprise you, about the things that will make us stronger, and different topics that you may or may not have thought about. And I'm going to be borrowing from, there is a scholar at Tufts University, Fletcher School of Diplomacy and Law. Her name is Monica Duffy Toft, and I'll be talking about her and how some of the things I've been talking about align with what she's talking about. So it'll be a lot of fun. And I'm really looking forward to next week. I think that's part 3, and it'll be great. So my name is Michael Smook. This is episode 26, part 2, Miscalculations. And today is July 13th, a lucky day for me. It's 2018, and it's a Friday, and I'm speaking from my home in Forest Hills, New York. Forest Hills is in Queens County, which is an outer borough of the city of New York. Until next time, goodbye, and good luck.